December 5th, 1941, 40 kilometers from Moscow. A panzer commander stood beside his Tiger, breath freezing midair. The engine, Germany's finest machine, wouldn't turn. Around him, 100 tanks sat silent, dead steel in a white grave. Behind them, the road stretched 2,000 kilometers back to Berlin. Ahead, the spires of the Kremlin shimmered through the snow like a mirage. They had conquered France in 6 weeks, Poland in 27 days. Now, 6 months into Russia, they couldn't move 10 meters. The commander looked east, toward the endless white. And for the first time, he understood. This war would not be won. The morning air was so cold it cracked, minus 40 degrees Celsius. Metal became brittle as glass. Oil turned to paste. Fingers froze to rifle triggers in seconds. Inside the command tent, maps were spread across a folding table. Red arrows pointing east, blue circles marking encirclements. Everything looked perfect on paper. But outside, reality told a different story. Soldiers wrapped their feet in newspaper. They burned furniture from abandoned villages just to feel their hands again. The wounded died not from their injuries, but from the cold that followed. Radio static crackled. Supply convoys were 3 days late, then 5. Then they stopped reporting altogether. A young lieutenant entered the tent, snow caked to his collar. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His eyes said everything. The diesel had frozen solid. The trucks wouldn't start. The tanks couldn't move. And Moscow was still 40 kilometers away. 40 kilometers. It might as well have been 4,000. 6 months earlier, it had all seemed inevitable. June 22nd, 1941. Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. 3 million men, 3,000 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces. The Wehrmacht crossed the Soviet border like a steel flood. Within days, entire Soviet armies ceased to exist. Minsk fell. Smolensk fell. Kiev, ancient Kiev, encircled, captured, 600,000 prisoners marching west in columns that stretched to the horizon. The panzers moved so fast the infantry couldn't keep up. 50 kilometers a day, 70. Towns surrendered before German scouts even arrived. Soviet commanders radioed for orders and received only static. In Berlin, champagne corks popped. The Führer declared victory was within reach. Generals began planning the victory parade through Red Square. Winter uniforms? Unnecessary. The war would be over by October. Franz Halder, chief of the General Staff, wrote in his diary, "It is not too much to say that the campaign against Russia has been won in 14 days. 14 days. They believed their own propaganda. They believed in the superiority of German steel, German tactics, German will. They had broken France. They had broken Poland. Why not Russia? But Russia was different. Russia didn't break. Russia absorbed. Russia swallowed armies whole and kept fighting. And now, standing in the December snow outside Moscow, the tanks silent and frozen, the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. The numbers came in slowly, then all at once. Intelligence reports landed on desks in field headquarters. At first, they were dismissed, then checked, then rechecked, then believed. Soviet tank production, October 1941. Reported destroyed, 17,000 tanks. Still operational, 2,000 tanks minimum. New production that month, 100 tanks every month. 1,000 tanks, built, shipped, deployed. The Germans had destroyed more Soviet armor than they thought existed. And still, more kept coming. Aircraft losses. Soviet planes shot down, over 8,000, Soviet planes still flying, thousands New aircraft per month, 1,200 casualties. Soviet dead, over 2 million. Soviet prisoners, 3 million. Soviet army still fighting, 60 divisions, 70, 80. The math didn't work. It couldn't work. In Germany, a single tank factory in Kassel produced 30 panzers per month. 30. The pride of German engineering. In Russia, factory number 183 in Kharkov, now evacuated, dismantled, moved beyond the Urals, was producing 20 T-34s per day. Per day. Entire factories lifted onto trains. Machinery, workers, even the factory roofs, transported 1,000 kilometers east, reassembled in Chelyabinsk, Sverdlovsk, Nizhny Tagil, cities the Germans had never heard of. Production resumed in weeks. One German officer stared at the intelligence summary, his coffee gone cold. "They moved entire factories?" he whispered. "Yes. 1,500 factories, evacuated in 3 months. 10 million workers relocated. Production never stopped. The Reich's annual steel production, 31 million tons. Soviet steel production, even after losing Ukraine, 18 million tons. German crude oil production, 6 million tons per year. Soviet oil, from Baku alone, 24 million tons. The numbers kept coming. Ammunition expenditure. German troops were rationed to 10 shells per day per artillery piece. Soviet guns fired 50, 100. Supply was endless. Manpower. Germany had mobilized every available man. The Wehrmacht was at full strength, 3.8 million on the Eastern Front. Soviet reserves called up in October, 1.5 million. November, another 1.2 million. December, 800,000 more. From where? How? The Soviet Union had a population of 190 million. Germany, 69 million. Even accounting for occupied territories, the disparity was staggering. One panzer commander sat in his frozen tank, reading a captured Soviet newspaper. It showed women working in munitions factories, teenagers assembling rifles, elderly men digging anti-tank ditches. Everyone was fighting. He thought of his wife back in Munich, listening to the radio, knitting socks. The Russians weren't just fighting a war. They were becoming the war. Every farm was a supply depot. Every factory was a fortress. Every citizen was a soldier. And the land itself, vast, endless, swallowing, fought alongside them. The commander folded the newspaper carefully. His hands were shaking. Not from the cold. December 6th, 1941. One day after the advance died, General Heinz Guderian, architect of Blitzkrieg, master of armored warfare, stood in his command post south of Moscow. Before him lay a map marked with blue and red. Blue for German positions, red for Soviet. 6 months ago, the map had been mostly blue. Now the red was everywhere, and growing. His chief of staff entered, saluted stiffly. "Herr General, the latest reconnaissance." Guderian didn't look up. "Tell me." Fresh Soviet divisions identified. 39th Army, 1st Shock Army, 10th Army, all from Siberia, full strength, winter equipped. Guderian's jaw tightened. How many men? Estimated 500,000, with tank support. From where? The Far East, sir. Transferred west by rail. Guderian finally looked up. The Japanese border? Undefended, sir. Intelligence suggests a non-aggression understanding. The general was silent for a long moment. While Germany had bled itself white trying to break Moscow, Stalin had been holding entire armies in reserve. Armies Germany didn't know existed. Fresh, rested, trained for winter warfare. German soldiers wrapped in frozen blankets, starving, equipment failing. Soviet soldiers in quilted jackets, felt boots, fur hats, fighting in their own winter. Guderian walked to the window. Outside, his panzers sat motionless, covered in snow like monuments, tomb markers. "We cannot advance," he said quietly. "We cannot hold, and now we cannot retreat." The chief of staff said nothing. "Do you know what this means?" Guderian turned. His face was gray, aged 20 years and 6 months. "It means the war is not won." He paused. "It means the war cannot be won. Not might be lost, cannot be won." The distinction was everything. Further north, near Leningrad, another realization was taking shape. A battalion commander named Victor Strauss watched his men dig into frozen earth with pickaxes. The ground was like concrete. Every meter took an hour. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Across no man's land, Soviet artillery opened fire. The same Soviet artillery that should have run out of shells weeks ago. But it hadn't. It never did. Strauss had studied the maps, calculated the logistics, estimated Soviet supply capacity based on German standards. Every calculation said the Russians should have collapsed by September. It was December, and they were stronger than ever. He remembered his training. Napoleon's invasion of Russia, 1812. The Grande Armée, 600,000 men, entered Russia in June. By December, barely 20,000 staggered back. Strauss had dismissed it as ancient history, irrelevant. This was the 20th century. Modern warfare, mechanized, efficient. But standing in the snow, watching his tanks freeze and his men die, he understood. The lesson wasn't that Napoleon failed. The lesson was that Russia didn't. Not then. Not now. Not ever. He looked east, toward the endless horizon. Somewhere out there, beyond the snow, beyond the forests, beyond the Urals, Soviet factories were running 24 hours a day. Tanks rolling off assembly lines, shells being packed into crates, trains moving west, always west, toward him. Strauss closed his eyes. The war was lost. It had been lost the moment they crossed the border. They just hadn't known it yet. The machinery of defeat had been set in motion long before the first shot was fired. It began with a single miscalculation. German intelligence estimated Soviet tank strength at 10,000 vehicles. Acceptable odds. The Wehrmacht had 3,400 tanks, but German tanks were superior. German tactics unmatched. German crews the best trained in the world. The actual number was 24,000. But even that wasn't the fatal error. The fatal error was believing that numbers mattered. The logistics trap. Every German advance was a race against mathematics. A panzer division required 300 tons of supplies per day. Fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, medical supplies. Multiply that by 20 divisions. 6,000 tons, every single day. The distance from the German border to Moscow, 1,000 kilometers. Soviet railways used a different gauge than European trains. Every supply train had to stop at the border. Cargo unloaded by hand, transferred to German wagons or trucks. Trucks that consumed fuel. Trucks that broke down. Trucks that froze. For every kilometer the Wehrmacht advanced, the supply line stretched longer, thinner, more fragile. By December, some forward units were receiving 30 tons per day instead of 300. 10% of what they needed. You cannot win a war on 10%. The industrial abyss. Germany's economy was impressive, efficient, organized. But it was an economy designed for short wars, blitzkrieg wars, 6-week wars. When the war didn't end in 6 weeks, the system began to crack. Steel allocation for 1941 prioritized U-boats, aircraft, ammunition. Tank production received what remained. Result, 3,800 tanks produced that year. The Soviet Union, in that same year, produced 6,500 T-34s alone, not counting older models, not counting the tanks being built in factories Germany didn't know existed. One Soviet factory worker was interviewed after the war. She remembered those months. We worked 18-hour shifts. We slept beside the machines. We ate at the machines. When the power failed, we worked by candlelight. When a worker collapsed, another took their place. The tanks never stopped. German factory workers worked 8-hour shifts, with lunch breaks and weekends. This wasn't a competition, it was an industrial execution. The strategic blindness. Hitler had ordered 3 objectives simultaneously. Leningrad in the north, Moscow in the center, Ukraine and the oil fields in the south, 3 army groups. 3 directions, each one weakening the others. When Guderian begged to concentrate forces on Moscow, the Führer refused. We need the grain from Ukraine, the coal from the Donbass. So the Wehrmacht spread itself across 2,600 kilometers of front. The Soviets could choose where to defend, where to counterattack, where to bleed the Germans white. And they did. The winter weapon. German intelligence knew winter was coming. What they didn't know, what they couldn't comprehend, was that winter in Russia wasn't just weather. It was weaponized geography. Every river froze solid. Cutting supply routes, every road became impassable mud, then ice. Every forest became an ambush zone. German soldiers wore wool uniforms designed for France, leather boots that froze solid. No winter coats, no antifreeze. Soviet soldiers had quilted Telegrika jackets. Valenki felt boots, fur ushankas, weapons designed to function at 40 degrees C. The Wehrmacht was fighting 2 enemies, the Red Army and the Russian winter, and both were winning. In Berlin, the Reich Ministry of Armaments finally understood. This wasn't a war that could be won with superior tactics. This was a war of mathematics, production, endurance, and Germany was losing every equation. December 8th, 1941. The order came down from Berlin. Hold all positions. Retreat is forbidden. But holding required ammunition they didn't have. Food that never arrived. Reinforcements that didn't exist. The counteroffensive began that morning. Soviet forces, fresh, winter-equipped, outnumbering the Germans 2-1, struck along the entire Moscow front. North, south, center. The Germans fell back, not in organized retreat, in chaos. Vehicles abandoned, weapons left in snowdrifts. Entire companies disappeared overnight. By January, the Wehrmacht had been pushed back 200 kilometers, the furthest retreat in German military history. 100,000 casualties in 6 weeks. Not from combat alone, from frostbite, from starvation, from cold so severe that men simply lay down in the snow and didn't rise. In April 1942, when the spring thaw came, the fields outside Moscow revealed their secrets. Frozen German soldiers still in firing positions. Tanks buried to their turrets. Supply depots that never reached the front. Letters home, undelivered, scattered across the mud. One letter was recovered by Soviet forces, written by a panzer commander on December 4th, 1941. It was never sent. The last line read, "We have conquered half of Russia, but Russia has conquered all of us." The war would continue for 3 more years. 3 brutal, grinding years. But the outcome was decided in those frozen days outside Moscow. The moment the engines wouldn't start. The moment the supplies didn't arrive. The moment German soldiers looked east and understood what lay before them. Not an enemy that could be defeated, but a vastness that could not be conquered. History remembers Stalingrad. History remembers Kursk. History remembers Berlin. But the war was lost outside Moscow. Lost not in a single battle, not in a catastrophic defeat, lost in the silent realization that victory was impossible, that the land was too vast, the people too many, the winter too brutal, the factories too distant, the resolve too strong. Lost in the moment, a tank commander stood beside his frozen panzer and understood. Russia would never end, and neither would this war, not until Germany itself ended. Out the snow continued to fall, covering the tanks, covering the dead, covering the dream of conquest. By spring, it would melt. But the truth would remain. In war, even perfect victories conceal your defeat. And sometimes, the greatest battles are won not by fighting, but by simply refusing to fall.